All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, and author of Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Sign up for the podcast feed at scotthorton.org or scotthortonshow.com. I've got more than 6,000 interviews in the archive for you there going back to 2003. And follow me on all the video sites and X at Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, introducing retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel L. Davis. He's the host of the Daniel Davis Deep Dive on YouTube, his great podcast. He is, of course, a veteran of Iraq War I, Iraq War II, and Afghanistan, where he was the great whistleblower of 2012. And can read all about that in Fool's Errand if you want. But he's absolutely excellent on everything, and especially his coverage of the Russia-Ukraine war. So welcome back to the show. How you doing, sir?
Always great to be here, Scott. Love it.
Well, really appreciate you joining us today. There's so much to talk about. I guess the most important thing is, well, I'm not sure what to do. I guess we got to do the status of forces on the ground and the order of battle and so forth, even just in a brief sketch here. So then we can talk about the talks, because I think the context of whose forces are where on the ground is the real background to the talks, right?
Oh, yeah, without question.
So who's occupying what and how's it look?
Well, so first of all, I think the most important thing is the Kursk direction, where last August the Ukraine side made a penetration deep into Russian territory in the Kursk Oblast north of the Sumy province in Ukraine. And at the time, so many Western people said, aha, this is great news. It just shows that that Ukraine has finally taken it to Putin. Now then they can see what it's like to have war on their own soil, stick in the face, haha. And it was a lot of celebration. The day it happened, I said, this is a complete disaster. This is diverting an already thinned force that they have and now sending them into something that has no even operational value. Forget about strategic value. It's not going to change the course of the war, because the Ukraine side didn't have the capacity to exploit this, to actually make a genuine deep penetration into Russia that would actually threaten them on anything of operational value. There wasn't even any tactical value for Ukraine there other than the PR value. And it looked good in newspapers, and they got lots of headlines really all over the world. It gave a temporary boost in morale to a lot of their troops. That's true. But all it was going to be doing was a diversion and a diminution of their force. It made them weaker because they had to continue for all these months shoveling force after force after force and reinforcements, ammunition, weapons, medical support, etc., food, fuel, water, bullets. I mean, all those things. It was enormous resource intensive for something that had no value to them, and it was a net loss of, depending on who you want to listen to, somewhere between 40 and 70,000 troops killed, and we don't even know for sure how many were wounded. And at the same time, that was causing fewer Ukraine forces on the eastern front, where the real issue is in the Donbass, so that Russia made a lot bigger gains as a result of that diversion of power from the Ukraine side. Well, there are many reports, and I think some are very valid, that Russia was aware of this incursion before it happened, actually made it easy for Ukraine to invade into that territory, but they had set parameters where they had basically defensive lines already pre-positioned so that it could only go a certain direction, and then they kept it open to continue having Ukraine divert its forces. Because here's something that's so important, Scott, that very few in the West understand, and I mean very few. Russia's objective is not first and foremost territorial acquisition. That's a byproduct. Their primary objective is the destruction of the Ukraine armed forces. That's what they're trying to do. So if they can kill them in larger numbers and an easier containment, basically shooting fish in a literal barrel or something close to that in the Kursk area, then that means there's fewer of them in the eastern front there. So if they kill them here or kill them there, the bottom line is that they're weakening the Ukrainian armed forces. Well, it turns out that now then the utility for that has, by the Russian high command opinions, for whatever their criteria are, they said, okay, it's no longer beneficial for us to have this. So like in a lightning move, and it started on about the 8th of March, they just said, that's it. We're going to close it down now. And then there was just this dramatic push and they just crushed it like a house of cards. And now there's literally only a handful of fields and 3 villages as of the time we're talking here left until they reestablish the border. Here's the double problem, and I think probably why the Russian side came to this conclusion. They're not stopping there. They've already started a new incursion in the Sumy province to the west of the Kursk salient, and another one just this morning on the east of that salient. So I think that when these troops get down to the border, and you saw Putin say this in a press conference he had with Gerasimov, his senior commander, a couple of days ago, he said, we're going to establish a buffer zone. Ergo, they're going to continue to press into Ukraine territory itself, opening another full front. So the situation on the ground militarily continues to worsen for Ukraine because the Eastern Front still has its constant pressure. So now then they're not going to have any troops to divert from one place to the other because they lost all of them that they had in the Kursk area. And now if Russia starts pushing in the Sumy province, they're either going to have to withdraw somebody from the Eastern Front to try to stem that tide because they have fewer defensive positions there, or they're just going to continue to lose everywhere. But in any case, this is bad for the UAF side.
All right, so a couple things there. I mean, the idea with Kursk was not just a PR stunt, wasn't it, that they were trying to divert Russian forces out of the Donbass? But that just didn't work. The Russian forces stayed in the Donbass. They just called new forces to fight in Kursk.
That's what they claimed at the time. They said that's what they said it was. And again, I said, I mean, that would be the dumbest thing Russia could ever do. You would have to be an idiot to do that. And they weren't idiots because look, there's somewhere around 700,000 Russian troops inside Ukraine, fighting inside Ukraine right now. But there's another up to 800,000 troops elsewhere in the Russian Federation. So they just took some of those other 800,000 and moved them into fighting this. And then, of course, they added between 10 and 12,000 North Koreans as well. And so they didn't pull anybody away. So once you figure that out, the only sane military thing to do for the Ukraine side would have been to withdraw and say, okay, well, we wanted this to happen. It didn't happen. Now it's pointless to hold this. So let's withdraw. Let's claim, yay, we hurt Russia for a while, but this was a temporary thing. And I thought that they were setting this up because Zelensky actually said that in the first month. He said, this is not a permanent deal. We're not staying here forever. We just want to achieve some objectives. You could have just said anything you wanted. Yes, we accomplished our objectives A, B, and C. Now we're doing the smart thing and we're going to reestablish our positions inside of our territory, blah, blah, blah. You could have done that. Instead, they resisted every opportunity to do that, and now they have again, and this is a repeating theme throughout Zelensky's tenure, he would not withdraw troops from a lost cause when he had a chance. When he got a chance to redeploy to a stronger position of defense. Instead, he resolutely and just relentlessly stayed in these areas, requiring every village, every house, every field to be taken by force from Russia or by the Russians. And instead of having a better position, made it easier. This is the perverse part. He made it easier for Russia to kill Ukrainian troops, and they still lost the territory. That's the key thing. If you withdraw from a bad position and then you go to a more defensible position, you increase the difficulty of the other side to then move towards you. Like you have large areas of open fields where the Russians would have to cross, makes it easier to kill them, etc. But by staying in these other positions, you made it easier for Russians because all they had to do was go from one house to the next as opposed to a huge open field. The bottom line is that by doing what I recommended, which would have been the sane military thing, you lose the city, you give it up willingly, but you give yourself a stronger position. Instead, they didn't give up the city willingly. They lost it anyway and lost the troops, and then they still had to go back to that position. It's the worst of all cases, and one of the reasons why they're losing this war.
All right, now, about the North Koreans, there were a lot of reports about that for a long time, and a lot of them seemed pretty disputable, but then I read in the Wall Street Journal, they said that they had direct access to 2 of these guys and questioned them themselves. The Journal reporters did, and that they were not, Asiatic Russians. They were, in fact, DPRK regulars who'd been sent there. I think you just said 10 to 12,000. What's your best information about the North Korean presence there? And does that not telegraph some weakness on the Russians' part that they had to go ask him for his forces to come and help, Danny?
Yeah, no, I think the West has badly missed this one. I think that the preponderance of evidence says that this was not something that Putin wanted, but that something that Putin was forced to take in order to get the ammunition and everything else from the North Koreans. This was, in my view, Kim Jong-un saying, hey, I need to get some combat experience for my troops. Not one person in my entire military has combat experience. I want to send these guys in there in some number to get some combat experience, and then they can come back and train the rest of my forces on the modern, requirements of military to strengthen my entire force. Because you're talking, these numbers are incredibly small on a national level. When you're talking about a war, 10,000 is nothing. Russia has no shortage of people. Everything has been confirming that Russia has hundreds of thousands of troops in reserve right now. So they could use any of them if they wanted to. And it's also difficult in fighting coalition warfare. I've done it, and it's difficult. I remember for myself once in Desert Storm, there was an Egyptian tank formation that was not far from us, and it was really difficult to coordinate because of the language issue, the compatibility issue of communication systems, et cetera, the ways of fighting, et cetera. It's difficult, and you got to be very careful so you don't have fratricide, which I've read some reports that there were some. So it's nothing but a headache for the Russian side. It didn't help them anything else. I think it was as a concession to Kim Jong-un to say, hey, I need some of this because this is what I want in exchange for all the help I'm giving you for the rest of the theater. So, no, I don't think it signaled any weakness on the Russian side. I think that it's just something that the North Korean side wanted.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we talked all about Kursk and all that. But so what is the situation? I believe the last map I saw has Russia in control of 99.9% of Luhansk or more. They have some presence in Kharkiv. Obviously, I don't know the exact proportion, but they control the supermajority of Donetsk Oblast, and I'm just spitballing here, about half of Zaporozhye and Kherson. Is that approximately right?
Probably a little more than half of the other two as well.
Okay.
They got a majority of all of them, but there's still large swaths of Donetsk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson that are still under Ukrainian control.
Mm-hmm. And then, so I guess I had read, this may have also been the Wall Street Journal, that said where the Russians had made major gains in previous months, that the Ukrainians had been putting up a fight or maybe even keeping them out of some of these cities that the Russians had thought that they had already succeeded in taking. And I know that the war party has their spin. They're trying to boost the Ukrainian side. But then again, they have fought for 3 years and they ain't dead yet. Not all of them.
That's a fact. Yeah, there have been, I think in Toretsk, the Ukrainian side has recaptured portions of that, one of those cities, and in one other area, and I can't think of where it is right offhand, they have made some tactical recaptured some certain areas, but they're portions of towns. There are, portions of blocks, and many of those, or some of those that they have taken, were retaken again in recent days. But this is just fits and starts here. It doesn't. It just like the Kursk offensive. This doesn't lead to anything because they don't have the capacity to exploit whatever they've gained. This is just something where they moved. They had a superiority of numbers in these given locations to try and take back something. Because they could. And so you can, in a front of, as Putin said yesterday, 2,000 kilometers total from Kursk all the way down to the Zaporizhia area. And so you can mass a certain number of troops in certain areas and achieve some local breakthroughs. But what is that going to do for you in the course of the war? Because you're still losing troops. You don't have the capacity to actually conduct an offensive or a counteroffensive that would cause Russia to have to move some. They're still moving forward in all the other areas, and the manpower pool on the Ukraine side still dwindles to this day. And you see, they can't even stop what happened in the Kherson area. In the Kursk area. So now then you're just following that the overall balance is still on the Russian side. You do have these at least two areas where there has been some meaningful tactical counterattack that was successful for the Ukraine side, but everything I can see shows that this is going to be short-lived, and it won't be another few weeks probably when they'll lose those again.
Mm-hmm. All right, now, so if I'm a hawk playing devil's advocate here, I might think that you're sort of rationalizing what's happened in Kursk because they were able to stay inside Russia for months and months, and then you're saying, aha, but see, it was a trick, and they were trapping them, and it was like what the police call kettling, right, where you group all the protesters down at one cul-de-sac before you start smacking them. So that makes sense. on the face of it. But at the same time, this invasion did happen back in August. And I think when we talked about it then, I don't think you expected for it to last till March at the time. And so is it just that the Russians weren't trying that hard to take Kursk back? It seemed like that would have been their highest priority, if only to demonstrate their strength, that you can't invade us, not for 6 days. You can't,
Well, no, that's why I said that is if the Russian attempt or interest in priority was the capture of territory or the recapture of territory in this case, then you can make that argument, because that's what the West would do. That's exactly what we would do. We're always focused on territorial acquisition. Ergo, so we're looking through our lens and saying, since they didn't, that was evidence of their weakness. Since they haven't taken, they were on the offensive for the entirety of 2024 and have continued on into 25. But when you look on the national level, the percentage of the territory that's been gained has been relatively small. So you say, okay, and many of the do. And in fact, I talk to people very often. The view is, well, they're just not that strong. They've only taken as much because that's all they can take, if they're using our strategy and doctrine. But if the Russians have a different strategy and a different objective and a different doctrine, then you have to look at it through a different lens, which I think is now starting to become clearer, because they kept this cauldron open and all they were doing was basically nibbling around the edges for forward. They didn't, like I said, they had 800,000 other troops not in contact inside Ukraine. They could have deployed 100,000, 200,000 and just crushed it just by sheer numbers if that was their objective. But instead, they kept relatively small numbers in there, and they just kept on keeping that cauldron open. They didn't even move to try and close off because it was kind of a bulge, sort of to speak, almost like the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. And Russia had access to the cauldron neck, so to speak, which they could have easily just said, all right, if we want to kill this, we don't have to take all this stuff. All we got to do is have two pincer movements here at the neck of it, at the border, close it off, and then they'll all be trapped. So if you wanted to do that, that would have been the most efficient way to do it. But it appears to me, and now the evidence is starting to stack up, that the Russians wanted to keep that cauldron open because of the diversion of all these troops and equipment and everything else, keeping them away from their priority of effort, what they've always said is the Donbass. And I say that that's been validated because now then that is no longer in Russia's interest to keep it open, then they crushed it in a matter of days. So they obviously didn't suddenly have, more troops come from somewhere else. They had them in place, but then they decided it was time to move, because I think they're going to start moving into Ukraine territory. That implies the physical evidence that was what Russia was doing, and now they changed their tide. They're doing something different, and they succeeded at that too.
Yeah.
Hey guys, I've had a lot of great webmasters over the years, but the team at expanddesigns.com have by far been the most competent and reliable. Harley Abbott and his team have made great sites for the show and the Institute, and they keep them running well, suggesting and making improvements all along. Make a deal with expanddesigns.com for your new business or news site. They will take care of you. Use the promo code SCOTT and save $500. That's expanddesigns.com. Man, I wish I was in school so I could drop out and sign up for Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom instead. Tom has done such a great job on putting together a classical curriculum for everyone from junior high schoolers on up through the postgraduate level. And it's all very reasonably priced. Just make sure you click through from the link in the right margin at scotthorton.org. Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom. Real history, real economics, real education.
Scott Horton Coffee. It's a thing. It's really great stuff, too. The Scott Horton Show Supreme Breakfast Blend from Moondoe's Artisan Coffees at moondosartisancoffees.com. I drink a lot of coffee, and I drink a lot of Folgers and things over the years, but I'm never going back now. Moondoe's is so good, and they have great wholesale deals for all you restaurateurs and Quickie Mart managers out there as well. They're now doing online commercial sales to coffee houses, coffee trailers, restaurants, and bakeries. So help support this show. Drink anti-war coffee. Click the link in the margin at scotthorton.org or just go to scotthorton.org/coffee. Seriously, buy some. And thanks. All right, so, which brings us to the talks and the various positions of the sides going in here. I mean, it's just been obvious on its face. I wrote in my book months ago that the Russians are in the position of strength. The Americans are just not. Trump has basically no cards to play here other than just carrots, right? He doesn't have any sticks. I just saw where he added some more sanctions. What's that going to do? He's going to put in some more attackums or something. That's not going to make any difference. So he doesn't have anything to threaten Russia with, that they better do what he says or else. He can promise normalization, and that's a lot, and I sure wish the Russians would take it. But then again, just like with Saigon and Kabul before, Kiev doesn't want a peace deal. They would rather keep fighting as long as they can keep America there fighting for them. But unlike Saigon and Kabul, they can last, I don't know exactly how long, but they can last without the U.S. government much longer. They have an actual standing army of some kind compared to like the Afghan National Army, which was just nothing but a joke, right? Which we had laughed about for years before it finally ceased to exist. So it seems like Zelensky's in a position where he can throw a wrench in all this. You can't make a peace deal without me because I'm going to keep fighting. And that was what blew up in that big contest in the Oval Office a couple weeks ago. It wasn't just, personalities. It was him saying, you can't negotiate with this guy. So I don't want to negotiate with him. And you guys are fools for saying you can negotiate with him. And I refuse to deal until I'm done winning the war. And the Russians have left all Ukrainian territory, which just means fight forever or until they're all dead. So that puts Trump in a very difficult situation, even if I think it's correct that he wants to end this war in an agreement with the Russians as soon as he can. I'm not sure he's going to be able to do that, and I'm very interested in what you think.
Yeah, on paper, Ukraine is definitely has the capacity. They could drag this out a long time, and you're 100% right that the capacity of the Ukrainian armed forces is miles better than what the Afghan armed forces were at the end of the time there. So they have proven tremendously capable with their limited resources on the battlefield, and they have my enduring admiration for how they fought under such incredibly difficult conditions. But it's ultimately going to be wasted valor because they don't have the capacity at the national level to continue to do this. If the United States pulls out, and by the way, I do concur with your assessment that Zelensky doesn't want a negotiated settlement, aside from what happened in the Oval Office, on the day that the U.S. and the Ukraine side were meeting in Jeddah, Ukraine chose that morning to launch a 370 some odd drone attack into Russia, specifically into Moscow, to just kind of spit in your face as we're allegedly meeting for a way to end the war. That's
I was going to mention that in my giant, long-winded, twisting, winding question.
Yeah, so that was just yet another evidence of it. Zelensky made a video yesterday where he said, in response to Putin's comments about his conceptual willingness to have a ceasefire, he said, he doesn't want it. He just wants to gum this up and he wants to keep fighting. And that shows you why we have to keep struggling here, because he doesn't even want peace and blah, 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 all this kind of stuff. But then you have to look at the capacity. Well, that's why I said a second ago, on paper, they can. And you saw he actually said, Zelensky, before he left town after that White House blow up with Brett Baer on Fox News, Brett Baer asked him point blank, if the United States stops support, can you keep fighting? And he said, well, it'd be more difficult, but yeah. So his mental position is already trying to do that. That's why he's trying to get support from European states, whatever they want, et cetera. But the fact is, if you pull the United States out, for example, if Trump concludes that, hey, I'm trying to set up a place to save your country to end this war, and you keep throwing wrenches in it, you're on your own. I'm out on this. And Trump has already indicated he is conceptually willing to do that. If that happens, now then, even though these Ukraine troops are good, if they know that they no longer have the backing of the United States, they know that the European side cannot match what we had. They can't bring that up. And the psychological loss of the superpower support that they have had for 3+ years, if that's gone, then I think that you're going to have a much higher possibility that the Ukraine army finally breaks just from the psychological stress of knowing that you're fighting a losing war. And now then you can't pretend otherwise. So we'll see how that actually works out. But even if they did, you're right, it could drag it out for another 6-9 months, maybe even another year. But ultimately, Russia has the manpower and the industrial capacity and all the other inputs to crush the Ukraine side, even if it's continuing by these fits and starts in this small amount. They just can't stop it on the Ukraine side.
And then, so what do you imagine are the extent of Putin's territorial ambitions here in the end? Once his forces get what they want, or once he sits down at the table and starts making his side of the demands, is he going to want?
I think that Putin has genuinely been willing to settle on the 14 June lines that he made last summer, which were the 4 administrative borders of the 4 oblasts, which you mentioned a good portion of the southern 3 are still under Ukraine control. And he said there has to be a new leader, meaning they have to have a presidential election, because he won't sign anything, Putin won't, until they have a legitimate leader that's stood for an election and won by the legal means. And the other big sticker that doesn't get much talk about in the West, but is always on the front of the Russian side, is the demilitarization. They said you can only have 85,000 is the number that they used in December, the Russians did. So it's not just the territory, it's the other things that goes along with it. That's why Putin said yesterday, that's why Lavrov said 2 days before that, and said many times, this has to get at the root causes of this, not just a stopping of the fighting, but the root causes that started it. To Russia's perspective, that means no NATO and no threat to its western border by whatever's left.
Yeah.
And those are the huge sticking points for Trump to have to negotiate away, much less Ukraine.
Right. Its new western border. So, but in other words, though, you don't think that Putin really wants to take Kharkiv province or city or Odessa?
Well, no, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't finish the thought. That's what, if we're willing to meet a negotiated settlement today, that's where the territorial ambitions are. But if we don't settle on that, meaning if we don't agree to a ceasefire on the very harsh terms that Putin appears to be setting, then they'll simply keep fighting. And I know that inside Russia, because I've read about this on Russian Telegram and Russian media, there is apparently a lot of pressure from inside Russia on Putin. Do not settle for those 4 oblasts, because Lavrov actually hinted at that a couple of days ago in an interview they released where he was speaking English, is that he mentioned the Russians on the Ukraine side of this. That's why they say there has to be some constitutional changes inside Ukraine, or the implication being they'll keep fighting to take that. And that territorial ambition would be up to the Dnieper River, and I believe would likely include Odessa and Kharkiv as well, maybe even going right up to the gates of Kiev. It could get that bad if the West doesn't agree to a deal.
Yeah. So that's the big province between the river and Donetsk, is the Dnipropetrovsk. I forgot how to say it. Nobody knows how to say it. Say it again.
Dnipropetrovsk, I believe.
Yeah, of course.
Maybe I'm saying it wrong too, but it's something like that.
Well, whatever. You got a good education. I can't say it. But anyway, that's a bunch of wide open space that from the beginning of the war, I thought, just playing it out from like an Austrian school kind of perspective, is once a government, in this case, Moscow, does something, now they're going to cause problems that then they got to solve. So like in this case, if they carve out the 4 provinces in the east and south there, but they leave and Kharkiv between the river and their new territory, then they're leaving a lot of Russian speakers, if not pro-Russian partisans, in those territories to the tender mercies of the new, much more right-wing and much more Galatian nationalist regime, based on people out of Lviv and in Kiev there. And so then you have the same problem again from the Russians' point of view.
Now, reasons why the hardliners in Russia are pushing Putin not to agree to the 14 June lines, but to take more everywhere that there's geographical Russian-speaking people, ethnic Russians, all the way up to the river, because they say there's too many to leave behind for that reason. We'll see how it plays out, but that's a dynamic inside Russia.
Yeah. Well, and of course, that would include Odessa, and
yes.
Odessa is also obviously an extremely valuable port city and everything too. So it really goes, Odessa may be, I don't know about Kharkiv, because Kharkiv has a strategic importance for its proximity to Russia there and all of that is a bit different. But Odessa is really just a jewel. Do you want to take it or can you afford to leave it alone? And it goes back to the question of Putin's real motive here. whether he's just trying to be a czar.
From everybody I've talked to, that Putin wants Odessa, but he wants it intact. He would not destroy the city like, say, Bakhmut or something like that, or Mariupol, et cetera. So they would do a siege where they would surround it, but they would not destroy it. They would take everything in the territory around it to preserve the city. That's my understanding from what the Russian mentality is.
Yeah. Well, here's something nobody ever says. Mark Milley was right. They should have gone to the table and said, okay,
I'm right with you on that
Uncle, back in September of 22. And remember, they had a peace deal going, and America and Britain came in and ruined it still in the spring of 22. So then they fought over the summer, and then they got their one big break in September, the weekend of September 11th, 2022. They handed the Russians their ass in Kharkiv and in Kherson at the same time, and everybody celebrated. And Milley said, negotiate now while you're only this far behind. That's what a wise man would do here. And then the weenies overrode him and said, no, this proves that you can kick the Russians' ass and drive them all the way out of the country. And that not only should you not deal, you should escalate.
I want to say about a month ago, it was Anthony Blinken that sank that. He's the one who said, no, according to the Times, that's who sank that. I think it was actually, the statement was in November of 2022. I've actually used it on my show several times because I'm in right agree with you. I disagree a lot with Milley, but I was right with him on that one.
Yeah. Yeah, we all were. Everybody who was good on this said, see, even Milley is saying, and we all knew it was the State Department weenies, but we didn't really know. But it was like, yeah, Sullivan and Blinken are in charge here. And then the footnote there that you're referring to is the New York Times. They called the article Secretary of War. It was about our chief diplomat, Antony Blinken, and how he exactly was the one who overrode the advice of the generals and said, no way. And remember, everybody, how it played out. We're going to do a big winter offensive, except they couldn't because the ground was too muddy. It never froze solid. So they said, we're going to do a spring offensive, but it just kept raining, so they couldn't go. So they said, we're going to do a summer offensive, and then they got like 14 kilometers or whatever the number was. They achieved absolutely nothing, got smashed. And that was the history of 2023 there. It was the absolute failure. And it was all Antony Blinken saying, don't listen to the guys who know how to fight. Listen to me. I know what to do here. Well, man, I'm sorry. I'm all out of time, but I want to keep asking you things. Dang. Oh, well, I'll just have to leave them wanting more, just like me. There's Romania, obviously, is a huge one. And and there's still much more to discuss about the negotiations there. But I guess we hit the heart of it. So
definitely look forward to coming back, though.
All right. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time on the show, Danny. Really appreciate talking to you always.
Talk to you soon. Thanks.
All right, you guys. That's Danny Davis. He wrote The 11th Hour in 2020 America, and he hosts the Daniel Davis Deep Dive on YouTube for you there. Thanks for listening to The Scott Horton Show, which can be heard on APS Radio News at scotthorton.org, scotthortonshow.com, and the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org.